Welcome to the Aaron Wildavksy Forum for Public Policy. I'm Henry Brady, the Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy. It's great to have everybody here tonight. This is the signature event for the Goldman School. It's a lecture which combines social science thinking with public policy thinking, and we have a long string of spectacular people who have come through here and given this lecture. Tonight, we'll do what we always do, which is begin with Lee Friedman discussing a little bit about the genesis of this enterprise, and then we'll have an introduction of the speakers, and then we'll have the talk itself. Tomorrow, I want to remind everybody, although others will do this as well, but I'm just going to say it and we'll keep repeating it. Tomorrow morning, we have a discussion at the Goldman School starting at 9 to 11 a.m. There's a continental breakfast at 8:30. This is in room 355 at the Goldman School. And this is a panel discussion where we discuss the lecture for this evening. Let me introduce Lee Friedman, who takes care of making this event the wonderful event that it is. Lee is a scholar at the Goldman School who works in a variety of areas, including supported work way back, but more recently a lot of work on energy policy, on electricity rates, and cap and trade, and issues like that. Lee is in charge of finding folks who can come and give this lecture, and has done this for many years, and he can tell you how he does it, because every year he comes through with another wonderful person. So Lee Friedman, please come up here and tell us about the Wildavksy Forum and its history. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry, and welcome everybody to the 16th annual Wildavksy Forum for Public Policy. I have two announcements to make before I tell you very briefly about the forum. One is that if you haven't yet turned off your cell phones, please do so now. And the other one is to please join us for a reception after the lecture is over, right here, just right out in the living room part of this building. So just go out the door and turn right, and we'll have a reception, and you're all welcome to come to that. Aaron Wildavksy was one of the most distinguished political scientists of the 20th century. He was a founder of the scholarly public policy movement, and he was the founding dean of the Public Policy School. He was an extraordinarily articulate person with strong views, often not popular ones. He engaged scholars from all disciplines in a manner that was public, critical, and at the same time, warm, exciting, and productive to the thinking of everybody that was present. He personified the concept of intellectual community and left us a legacy that those of us who knew him will never forget. We're very, very proud to have Aaron's wife, Mary Wildavksy, amongst us this evening. And Mary, to honor Aaron, we created this living memorial, the Aaron Wildavksy Forum. Our intent is to bring both intellectual excitement and community to the campus, as Aaron Wildavksy brought to us. We've had many distinguished speakers, like sociologist William Julius Wilson, psychologist and Nobel laureate Danny Kahneman, economist Rebecca Blank of the Brookings Institution. We have the Wildavksy Forum book series that's published by UC Press. Recent books include Godly Republic by University of Pennsylvania political scientist John Giulio about government support of faith-based programs, and the book Falling Behind, How Rising Inequality Harms the Middle Class by Cornell economist and New York Times columnist Robert Frank. The next book is by Stanford political scientist John Bendor, Grounded Rationality and Politics, and it contains work that was originally stimulated by Aaron Wildavsky's great contributions to our understanding of public budgeting, and it's available for pre-order on the UC Press website. Becky Blank's book on income inequality is in press, and it'll be out in the fall. I'd like to offer my thanks To the members of the Wildavksy Forum Selection Committee, Henry said I would tell you how we do it. I don't do it. The Wildavksy Forum Selection Committee does it. Professor Robert Reich, Rucker Johnson, and Laura Stoker for their careful work and for their fine choice of this year's speaker. And I'd also like to thank Dean Brady for his support of the forum, and Sandy Ketchpel for all her logistical work in making arrangements for this event, and the Goldman School staff and student volunteers for all their assistance in implementing it. Our format is to have a lecture this evening with some time for audience questions and comments that Professor Robert Reich will moderate later. Tomorrow morning, as Henry mentioned, from 9 to 11, the discussion will continue in the seminar room on the top floor of the newer GSPP building that's at the corner of Hearst and Leroy, for those of you who may not know, and you are welcome to attend that as well. Professor Rucker Johnson will moderate tomorrow with two other distinguished colleagues as discussants, Professor Jane Malden of Public Policy and Professor Margaret Ware of Political Science and Sociology. Tomorrow they will offer reactions to this evening's address, and following our speaker's response, we will open up the discussion to all those present. And now to introduce our Wildavksy Forum speaker, please welcome Professor Robert Reich.
Well, thank you, Lee. It really does give me enormous pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Actually, two speakers, because the book that they will be talking about, the inchoate, the incipient book, is a product of both of their work. Let me just tell you a little bit. Katherine Newman is a dear friend, and I'm going to read to you something that you can already read on the program, but I'm going to give it a more dramatic reading because it deserves it. Katherine Newman is the Malcolm Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs and the Director of the Institute for International and Regional Studies at Princeton University. Formerly Dean of Social Science at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University and the Malcolm Weiner Professor of Urban Studies at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Got her PhD here at Cal. The most... The rest of it is really not all that impressive. She's the author of 9 books on topics ranging from urban poverty to middle-class economic insecurity to school violence. Her most recent book, in collaboration with Elizabeth Jacobs, is Who Cares? Public Ambivalence and Government Activism from the New Deal to the Second Gilded Age. And that's Princeton University Press in 2010. Historical analysis of public opinion toward government intervention on behalf of the poor. You may know, I'm sure you do know, of Kathy's other books, Fallen from Grace, just a wonderful, very careful, typical, closely watched sociological and anthropological look at poverty, at particularly group of poor young people. No Shame on My Game, The Missing Class, or I guess it's Missing Class, and I could go on. These are wonderful, wonderful books. They are not only books that are rich in terms of their sociology and anthropology for specialists, but they are also wonderful to read. She writes with enormous grace and feeling and combines a kind of academic and scholarly view with a feel for public policy and social policy and a concern for the poor. And therefore, you go across borders in a wonderful way, Kathy. She has won a number of awards, including the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Book Prize and the Hillsman Book Award, and appears frequently on public radio and television. Her current work, which she'll be discussing tonight on taxing the poor, is in collaboration with Rourke O'Brien. And Rourke, well, he's impressive in his own right. I almost introduced him this morning as Brian O'Rourke. The right ethnic group, but not exactly the right. Rourke is a doctoral candidate in sociology and social policy at Princeton and non-resident research fellow at the New America Foundation. And so both of you are going to present. And I want to thank both of you for joining us. It's a real treat and honor. Thank you.
So in the fall of 2007, I had the opportunity to go to Alabama to work with this organization, Alabama Arise, which is an advocacy group that was working on trying to repeal the food tax that appeared in this film. The experience was very sobering for me because the degree of poverty and its instantiation in the South was beyond anything I had ever seen, and I'd been studying poverty most of my academic career. This effort to repeal the food tax failed miserably, and I became very interested when I returned back to the Northeast in the extent to which these policies were used, policies involving food tax and their consequences for the poor. And even more than that, why it was so difficult to change a policy that is widely understood to be damaging to the health and well-being of the poor people of the southern states. As it turns out, the distribution of food tax as a source of public revenue is not random. When you look at these dark green states, you see how concentrated the policy is of making use of it to fund the public sector. As of 2008, 32 states and the District of Columbia fully exempt food for home consumption from state and local sales tax. The remaining 18 states treat food differently. 2 states, including the one I was visiting, Alabama and Mississippi, treat food like any other good and tax groceries at the full state and local rates. 3 states, Louisiana, Georgia, and North Carolina, exempt food from state sales tax but allow localities to tax it, and they do often tax it at a very high rate. What we want to do tonight is to explore the regional differences in the ways in which taxes are raised, the historical patterns of property tax, the emergence of supermajority rules that make it exceedingly difficult to change any other kind of tax and hence leave sales tax as a major revenue-raising device, especially throughout the South. Then we want to look at patterns of revenue and spending that affect the poor in the South. And then we're going to fast forward beyond the history to the last 25 years and look at how tax policy has changed in the different regions of the country. We're going to try and argue that the federal government has actually undertaken some very progressive steps to sharply reduce the burden of taxation on the poor, but that the states have diverged quite sharply from one another. The non-southern states have largely followed the lead of the federal government in reducing the tax burden of the poor, principally through the use of the Earned Income Tax Credit. But the southern states have gone the other direction. And we're going to try and argue that that's had a very damaging set of consequences for the poor. In particular, we're going to try and show you that there is a relationship between state and local taxation and the kinds of outcomes that poverty scholars like Rourke and myself are most interested in. So we're going to take you through a series of outcomes that matter to poverty scholars like teenage childbearing, early mortality, educational attainment, and we're going to try and show you that there is a relationship between the way in which states tax the poor and the dimensions of those outcomes. We are going to try and argue that we understand a little bit, at least, about the mechanism by which this taxation burden translates into those outcomes. And then finally, we will look at how the federal revenue flowing into the South has grown and grown as it has been reduced elsewhere in the country, but the extent to which this is making a difference to the well-being of the poor is very modest indeed. So let me start first by talking about regional differences in the way income poverty and poverty-related outcomes roll out. And I'm going to show you a series of maps that after a while will get to be rather boring. They'll get to be boring because they show more or less the same pattern for almost all these outcomes. Very negative-looking outcomes in the South. So let me start with median income. And when we look at median household income, we see, of course, it's not exclusively a southern problem, but a big block of southern states in which median household income is very low. Children in extreme poverty. There's a very high concentration of children in extreme poverty, meaning 50% of the poverty line. Or 2008, that would be less than $8,000 for a family of 3. With these very low incomes in households with children, you will not be surprised to learn that there are a whole bunch of other outcomes that follow from this that look especially bad in the South. Starting with life expectancy. Life expectancy is considerably lower on average in the South than it is in other parts of the country. Age-adjusted mortality is a measure that demographers frequently rely on to more or less generally gauge the health of a population, and it looks pretty bad in the states of the old Confederacy. Infant mortality. Infant mortality is very pronounced in the South, and some might argue that most of the outcomes we've told you about are merely picking up on the differences in the racial composition of the states. So we're going to go through a series of slides here that show you how these outcomes look among whites to try and argue that this is not merely a problem of racial distribution. The high concentration of African Americans who suffer from much higher levels of these negative outcomes than do other racial groups is pronounced in the South, but the next set of slides will push us away from race all by itself as the explanation. So let's start with white infant mortality. Again, it looks pretty bad in the South. This is by no means exclusively a Southern issue. None of the outcomes we're going to look at are exclusively bad in the South. There are problems elsewhere, but it is a particularly pronounced pattern in the South. Deaths from stroke. Again, these are non-Hispanic white deaths from stroke or cerebrovascular disease, and we see a pretty heavy cluster in the southern region. Deaths from heart disease. Now, if we were only looking at health outcomes, we might think, well, this is bad, but it's confined to health issues. Now we're going to look at a series of slides that have nothing to do with health per se, but look at these other poverty-related issues, starting with teenagers who are high school dropouts. High school dropouts are on a one-way ticket to a lifetime of poverty in most parts of the United States. And again, you see a pronounced picture below the Mason-Dixon line. Idleness. This is the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds who are not attending school, who are not working, and have no degree beyond high school. And as I say, it's not exclusive to the South. The Southwest has its problems as well. But the southern region doesn't look particularly healthy on this score. Teenage births. Having a child in their teen years is also often a lifetime burden for those who are forced out of the labor market as a consequence, whose education is truncated early. The southern states do not have by any means an exclusive lock on this pattern. The southwestern states, especially Arizona, New Mexico, with their very large Latino migrant populations, also have problems with teenage births. But from Texas eastward, we see a cluster of states with very high levels of teen births. Health outcomes and these education outcomes and family formation outcomes are serious, of course, but when we turn to questions like crime, we start to see this pattern broaden out. So these social measures look pretty troubling too. Property crime rates are higher in the southern region, and not surprisingly, the prison population per capita in the South is also extremely high. And that's not just because of crime rates. Of course, the South has particularly punitive incarceration policies. But once again, we see this dense cluster or cloud hovering over the South. Now, what has all of this got to do with taxation? Well, to begin this part of the story, we're going to rely heavily on the work of our colleague here in the audience tonight, your very distinguished economic historian, Robin Einhorn, who gives us a place to begin with her book on called American Taxation, American Slavery. In that book, and Robin will correct me if we've got this wrong, Southern tax policy privileged property owners with very low taxes on property, including slaves. And this tended to sort of dull or dent and stunt the development of the public sector in the South. So going into the Civil War, the South had an underdeveloped taxation system, Robin Einhorn tells us, relative to the North. And our own analysis of property tax bears her out. Here we see the southern states in 1860, at the very beginning of the Civil War, with the lowest property tax revenue per capita. The southern states are the ones with the wavy bar there. With the exception of Louisiana, which was able to generate revenue from trade and commerce in New Orleans, the southern states are at the very bottom of the property tax barrel. The Reconstruction era changed this picture. Of course, as you all know, the South loses the Civil War, in part because it didn't have a mature system of taxation. It made it very difficult to raise revenue to support the war effort. During radical Reconstruction, local political officials, and aided by congressmen in federal office, begin to alter this pattern. As blacks claim political power and set about to reform the tax system to generate sufficient revenue to educate the newly free black population and to attend to the needs of poor whites as well, tax rates begin to rise. And here we see a glimpse of some of that progress. In 1870, some southern states are starting to catch up with the rest of the country. Note Arkansas, for example, which increased its property tax rate by nearly 400% over the 1860 figures in nominal dollars. But the end of radical Reconstruction in the mid-1870s starts to spell an end to this policy. As our colleague Eric Foner reminds us, if radical Reconstruction had lasted 50 years instead of the short period of time it did last, we would be looking at a country that would be very different in terms of race relations and racial equality. The Redemption era, which starts in 1873 or so, leads the federal government to pull out. Whites regain control of the local political apparatus. And it's during Redemption that whites enact a series of laws to disenfranchise and discriminate against blacks that would come to be known as the Jim Crow regime. But some states, notably Alabama, put in place a number of procedural obstacles to ensure that it would be hard ever again to tax if blacks did regain political power. So the experience of radical Reconstruction taught the white power structure a lesson about what would happen if black political power grew, what would happen in terms of tax policy, and the birth of these supermajorities and procedural hurdles to taxation begin to spell a kind of permanent limitation on the capacity to raise taxes. Here's an example taken from a fascinating volume on Reconstruction. The example here is of state land tax on a farm of 160 acres in Mississippi, and this is just one of a number of examples we could have pulled on. We see an incredibly low tax rate in the years leading up to the Civil War. The years shaded in red are the height of radical Reconstruction, when African Americans had political power. And we see that the tax rate on this typical farm is significantly higher in that period than it was afterwards. After 1873, whites regained political control, and we see two things in this farm: a significant decrease in the tax rate and a significant decrease in the assessed value of the property. The lowering of the tax rate and the artificial devaluing of property for tax assessment served to reduce the taxes collected to well below pre-war levels. So by the time we get to the Redemption era and the Jim Crow era, once again the southern states are at the very bottom of taxation for state and local property tax, and the South is marching backwards once again. So as it marches backwards, the presence of these supermajority rules begins to take a strong bite. Now, as a native Californian and a sort of refugee from Proposition 13, I always thought California was sui generis in its use of supermajority rules. But what we see in this list of devices that make it very difficult to raise taxes is that the southern states beat California to this task by a mile, actually by many decades. So Alabama, I've already talked about, creates a constitutional limit on property tax and education spending, and then invokes a statewide referendum required to approve any state or local tax increase written into the Alabama Constitution in 1901, and it's still there, and that's why the measure that I went to campaign for failed, because when it came to a statewide referendum, all of these measures fail. Louisiana enacts a constitutional limit to property tax and spending in the 1870s, and also changes land assessments to devalue property at about the same time. Fast forward to the Great Depression era, and we see in Arkansas that a supermajority is required to raise any tax except alcohol and sales tax. So not surprisingly, All the other taxes stay fixed, the more progressive taxes, and sales tax begins to rise. One could make an argument that the potential coming of black political power was behind an era of supermajority rules spreading to other southern states during the civil rights era. So 1966 in Louisiana, 1970 in Mississippi, 1971 in Florida, we see the introduction of the same kinds of supermajority rules. And then it begins to spread way outside the South, arriving here in the great state of California, where it has done so much damage to your university as well as to the public schools I went to when I was a child. The consequences of supermajority rules are many. They create inertia. If you were a low-tax state to begin with, you don't grow. If you're starting off at the bottom, even if you grow, you remain at the bottom. Neighboring states are eager to lower their rates so as not to lose advantage over the states nearby with these supermajority rules in place. But most of all, supermajority provisions hold down all taxes that can be progressive, like income tax, property tax, corporate tax, and leave usually only one device for raising more revenue, the sales tax. Note that while this had, I think, a racial and definitely conservative political origin, this clips the wings later on even of progressive Southern governors. So when the three Southern governors in Clinton's era come into power and want to do something about the abysmal state of funding for Southern schools, they too have only the device of state sales tax to turn to, and that's exactly what Clinton did. So now we're looking at 2006, which is the most recent year we come up to. And again, these charts are looking depressingly similar because the spread of supermajority rules limit those property taxes and income taxes, and even those progressive Southern governors can't really budge this. We don't have state income tax in this slide. We're still working on that, but I can tell you that Florida, Texas, and Tennessee have no state income tax. Mississippi and Alabama permit the deduction of all federal taxes from state tax. Think about that for a moment. Usually it works the other way around. If you can deduct your progressive federal tax from your state tax, the wealthy are not paying very much in the form of state income tax as a result. This doesn't look like a very good bet for progressive taxation. Now, is this just a historical story? The answer is no. Now we're going to fast forward into the last 25 or 26 years and take a look at both spending and taxation. The interesting thing for both of us was that over the last quarter of a century, government spending at the state and local level has really zoomed up. It's zoomed up all across the country. It's nearly doubled, actually, across the board, and that's after adjusting for inflation. Well, where was the money going to come from to pay for all of this? First of all, a lot of this growth is due to increases in social expenditures on education, on public welfare, on health and hospitals. Federal spending on these programs has increased too, but much of this new federal spending, for example, Medicaid, comes with very heavy matching requirements at the state and local level. So where is this revenue going to come from in order to pay for these increased responsibilities? Well, in the South, it would appear that very little of it is going to come from individual income tax revenue. Although the rate has increased in the South somewhat over the last 25-year period, that orange line is the South, and all the other regions are up above it. And you can see that the lowest level was in the South to begin with, and it just stayed that way. So those increased expenditures are not going to be coming very much from individual income tax. What about corporate income tax? Well, again, the South and sadly the West, which is starting to look a little bit more like the South every day, are deriving very modest amounts of public revenue from corporate income tax. So the increased spending is not going to be paid for that way. What about property tax? Again, these graphs start to look a little bit boring because there is that orange line at the bottom, and property tax doesn't seem to be a very popular source of revenue in the South either, and that is partly because those supermajority rules are making it very difficult to increase property tax. And now we're going to see a different set of lines, because this is state and local general sales tax revenue per capita. Throughout the country, with the exception of the Northeast, the regressive solution appears to be the favored choice for increasing revenue, with the West and the South leading the way. And that is Proposition 13 in action. In both of those regions, the presence of supermajority rules that make it very hard to raise any other kind of tax would seem to be at work in promoting sales tax. But the popularity of regressive taxation would seem to be quite widespread. In fact, when we look at the composition of state and local tax revenue by source, here's what we see. The South is, now this is looking at total tax burdens, state and local tax burdens, where the revenue comes from. And now we can compare what these regions derive from different forms of taxation. And you'll see that orange bar in the South, which is sales tax, it dominates the tax landscape for the southern states. The West is starting to look more like that. And we would like to be able to go backwards in time to see when this began, but my guess is this is Proposition 13, among other things, at play. The Northeast is completely different. The property tax remains a very high source of revenue, and the Midwest as well. So we've got more progressive forms of taxation supporting the public sector. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rourke.
All right, so all of the things that Kathy's been talking about so far have concentrated pretty much on per capita rates. But what we are really interested in is how these tax burdens are distributed. So what are the poor actually paying? So you can look at a way the state's kind of generating revenue, but this doesn't really tell us exactly who's paying the cost. So what we did was we constructed a hypothetical family. We're trying to get a sense for what this family would pay in state and local tax in all 50 states. So our assumptions are these. So we picked a family of 3, and we said they had an income at the poverty line. This family has 1 working adult and 2 dependent children under the age of 18. We made them a renter, which is pretty common at this income level, and it also made it, obviously much easier to do tax estimates. So first thing, to model state income tax liability, we relied on MBER's TaxSim database. So this is a well-used database that kind of basically combines administrative tax data with tax return survey data to basically try to get an estimate of how much people are paying in state income tax. We wanted to make sure that we were capturing the true extent of the burden, the true bottom dollar that people were paying. Because a lot of states use pretty interesting means to actually funnel money back to people. So in California, you have a refundable child tax credit. A lot of states also have renters credits. So we wanted to make sure we were really getting to the bottom line and not just kind of a simulation of whatever the administrative rules are. So we double-checked NBR's database by going through TurboTax. So I went through and filled out a hypothetical return for our family for all 50 states in TurboTax. And so tax day is in 2 weeks, and I'm happy to help if anyone has any questions. I get about 50 emails a day from them reminding me to file in Oklahoma and Alabama and every other state. So what we're happy with there was that the returns looking TurboTax were pretty similar to the TaxSim data that we had. So we were pretty confident that we were actually capturing the right bottom line for our family there. The question on sales tax was much more difficult. And this, I think, a real value added and something that people that we haven't seen modeled before. And so to do this, what we did was we worked with some colleagues in Washington who have been doing kind of similar work on trying to get at tax burdens. And what we did is we modeled the spending, the spending on a bundle of goods that this family would have on anything that could be taxed. So clothing, household goods, food in those states that it matters. And so what we did was we tried to figure out how much money this family at this income level with this characteristic spend on this basket of goods that could be subject to a state and local tax. And then we applied that amount of spending to the state tax rate for that specific good. And what's important here is that what's really important to note is that in some states, you might have a nominal tax rate of 7%, but what's really important is what that rate is applied to. So if food is exempt, if clothing is exempt, then you have large swaths of the household budget that aren't touched by the sales tax. So while 2 states might have the same nominal sales tax rate, if in one state they're taxing food and clothes and basically everything that people are consuming, the tax burden is going to be much higher on those families. So we use state tax handbooks for the last 28 years to basically use that administrative data, and we basically just multiplied the amount of money that a hypothetical family would have spent on that good by the tax rate in that state, and that's the numbers that we got for the state and local sales tax liability. So our total tax liability, which we're going to be talking about kind of going forward, is just adding these two together. So this is the state income tax and the state and local sales tax. All numbers are adjusted for inflation, so Taxim does that directly, and then the state and local sales tax, we basically took the hypothetical family and walked the poverty line down, which is adjusted by inflation, and then scaled the numbers back up. You'll notice in all of our analyses there are 49 states. Alaska is excluded from analysis for a couple different reasons. When they talk about their tax system is actually kind of different from a lot of other states in the way that they construct their local sales tax, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also the payments from the Alaska Permanent Fund, they think makes their tax system more progressive, although that can be argued. And it's also hard to put in a dummy for Sarah Palin in most regression analyses. So we felt okay leaving out Alaska because it's a little bit different from the other 49 states. Okay, so we start with the federal story. And this is where everyone's pretty much been focusing their attention in the tax literature as it relates to poverty in the last 30 years or so. And what we see here is the total federal tax liability for our hypothetical family at the poverty line over the last 25 years or so. And what you see is a pretty dramatic decline. And this is, obviously the expansion of the EITC in the 90s. And this has been the big story of the federal tax system, is that we started to use the federal tax system as a way to give money back to the poor. It's become a major tool for fighting poverty in the United States. And this is the story that everyone's focused much of their attention on. And this is the way that a lot of us have been thinking about tax policy in the United States as it relates to poverty. But something very different happens when you look at the state level. So what we have here is the state and local sales tax liability for a family of three at the poverty line, and this is in the Northeast. And so what we see is over this period of time is it's generally flat. You see, obviously, metropolitan New York kind of goes up and down, and that has a lot to do with how the city is adjusting its rate and what it counts. But for the most part, you see a pretty flat trend. But keep this picture in mind as we move from the north to the south. And what you see over this period of time is a pretty dramatic increase across the board in the amount of sales tax that families are paying to states and localities. And this is pretty much, a lot of this is increasing the rates on food, increasing the rates on clothing, and some of them have started increasing services, et cetera. But we see is a pretty marked contrast between the north and the south. And so this is sales tax. So next we're going to turn to income tax. So what does the income tax burden at the state level look like for a family of three at the poverty line over this period? And so here's the Northeast. And what you see here is that the trend is relatively flat, and then you see a pretty dramatic downward turn. And so many of the states in the Northeast are actually in negative territory. And so what is this? This is states doing their own EITC. So this is northern states are following the federal lead in actually using the tax system as a tool to fight poverty and to actually give money back to the poor using the tax code. So by the end of this period, virtually no state in the Northeast actually has a tax liability, an income tax liability for a family of three at the poverty line. They've either zeroed out or they've actually given pretty substantial refunds. So compare this picture with the South. And here again, you'll notice that it's relatively flat, I think with the notable exception of Alabama at the top. What you see here is no state is going below zero. So no state is actually using the state tax system to refund money to the poor. And what's interesting is this doesn't mean these states don't have earned income tax credits, as a lot of states were kind of jumping on the bandwagon and trying to get a lot of good press about using the tax code to serve the poor. A number of these states actually implemented EITCs of their own. The problem is that in many of the states, the tax liability the family had was so great that the EITC wasn't enough to actually result in a refund. It would reduce the tax burden, but it wouldn't actually funnel any money back to them. And then in some states, it was not refundable in the first place, so it could only take your liability down to zero. So while some of these states nominally have EITCs, they tend to be too small to actually result in a net refund to families. And so this is kind of a picture of what this looks across the four regions. And what you see here is the pretty dramatic difference between the Northeast and the South. And so of all these four regions, it's the South over this period of time where we've seen this rather dramatic increase in the amount of money that a family of three at the poverty line is paying in state and local taxes. And you see here the Northeast is really starting to use this system to funnel money back, whereas the South continues to take money from poor families. But what does this matter? And so kind of trying to bring this full circle to the poverty-related outcomes that we're interested in, is there a relationship between this taxing of the poor, this increasing of the tax burden on the poor, and the poverty-related outcomes that we care about? So our strategy has a few parts. First, we just want to talk a little bit about change over time. So how the change in the taxes in the last 25 years relates to some of the changes in the outcomes that we care about, just showing that graphically. And then we'll use state and year fixed effects models, which I'll explain in a second. And then we're going to talk a little bit about mechanisms, how we think this is going to work. So what we have here is a map of the change in the state mortality rate and the change in tax over poor over the last 25 years. And so what you have on the x-axis is the change in age-adjusted mortality, and what you see here is all states are negative. So all states did see some improvement over this period of time in their state age-adjusted mortality rates. You see on the y-axis is the change in tax on the poor. So those that raise their taxes on the poor will be higher on the y-axis, and those who lowered their tax on the poor, actually started giving refunds, will be lower. And what you see here is this cluster of southern states in the top right. So it's the same states that increased their taxes on the poor during this period that also saw the least steep decline in mortality. So they didn't improve as quickly as everyone else. And that's a pretty strong clustering up there. So we turn from mortality now to the same analysis of property crime. And here again, we see a strong clustering in the top right of southern states. So we see during this period that many states did see an improvement on their property crime rates. They actually had a negative change over this period. But many of the states that actually saw an increase in property crime in this period were the same states that saw a dramatic increase in the tax burden on the poor. And so then one more will show us the same relationship for violent crime. Not nearly a strong clustering, but a similar relationship. States that tax the poor more also saw either not as good a reduction in violent crime or actually saw an increase during this period. But that does not tell, correlation does not imply causation, as we all know. A lot of things can be moving at the same time. So what we've tried to do is employ a few statistical models that'll basically try to isolate if these two changes are actually working together in a way that we can make a case for that taxes are actually having some impact on these outcomes that we care about. So what we use here are state and year fixed effects regressions. I'm happy to do more of this song and dance tomorrow during the 9 to 11 period. But the idea of these models is that they allow us to control for what's different about individual states. So we know that the South looks different from the North in a lot of different ways. Different, Southern cooking is worse for you. Other patterns that we can think of that might explain how these two things are moving together. Maybe the South is just different in a certain way. By putting in state controls, we're allowed to net out all the things that make states different. And what we're doing then is just focusing on the things that change over time. And so on the same way, we put in year effects. And what this allows us to do is to control for things that change over time and equally affect all states. So here we're able to net out kind of a federal policy shift like the EITC that affects all states equally. And so what we're doing here is we're just focusing on the change in the tax and the change in the outcome that we care about. And that allows us to net out a lot of the competing explanations for why we might be seeing this relationship. At the same time, we do have to account for things that might also be changing in the states at the same time that could explain both outcomes. That could explain increasing tax on the poor and increasing mortality rates, for example. So a few things that from the literature we decided to control for that we think are especially important and changed a lot over this period are the racial composition of each state. So the percent Black and percent Hispanic, we obviously saw a major migration of Hispanics into the South during this period. So we wanted to make sure that that change is captured in our models, and that's not explaining the relationship we see. We also control for the state poverty rate, the state direct expenditure. So obviously a big part of a tax story is if you don't collect much in tax revenue, you don't have much to spend. So we're trying to actually net out that the effect is actually the burden taking dollars out of people's pockets, not like some other effect of we didn't raise much money, so now we can't spend much money on the poor. So we wanted to capture that in the models in case states were changing how much they were spending over this time. State GDP per capita, it's a very big country with many small business cycles happening. We wanted to make sure we weren't getting some sort of regional differences in the economy. For the same reason, we wanted to control for state unemployment rate. The state Gini coefficient, so that's just a measure of inequality. Inequality, we all know, has been theorized to be related to health and crime outcomes especially. And we also wanted to get in some measure of the changing federal efforts. So it could be the case that the federal government stopped giving money to some state or was giving money to one state and not another. So we wanted to get some measure of that into our analysis. So this is all the stuff that's going into the models that we're going to show right now. So the first effect, regression is state and local tax burden on the poor and state-level age-adjusted mortality rate. And so what we see here is a strong positive relationship between an increase in tax on the poor and an increase in a state's age-adjusted mortality rate. And so you can interpret this coefficient as a $100 increase in taxes on the poor is associated with an increase in the state age-adjusted mortality rate of 6.7 per 100,000. So this is the change over time within a state. If you raise your taxes, it's associated with an increase in the state mortality rate. And to give you a sense of the magnitude, the average state age-adjusted mortality rate was 802 per 100,000 in 2006. So this is mortality. And then this is the same model applied to taxes and property crime. And here again, we see the same strong positive relationship. So if you increase your taxes on the poor during this period, you saw an increase in the state property crime rate. And this is net of changes in the demographics, changes in the business cycle, changes in state spending, changes in inequality, and also, like I said, net on things that are unique about states that don't change over time that we're also controlling for. And so here you'd interpret this coefficient to be a $100 increase in taxes on the poor is associated with an increase in the state property crime rate of 78 per 100,000. And that gives you a sense of the magnitude is about 3,200 is the average state property crime rate. And next we'll turn to violent crime. So again, the same thing. These tables are probably starting to look boring. Same idea here. At those states that increased tax on the poor also saw an increase in the state violent crime rate. And this is about 12.3 per 100,000 of a magnitude of 400 is about the average across the states. Taxes on high school completion. So here again, we see a negative relationship. So states that increased their tax on the poor actually saw a decrease in their state high school completion rate. And this, we admit the whole time that these coefficients are quite small. We think a lot of that has to do with the fact that these models are really trying to isolate an effect, and I think the magnitude could be debated, but it's really, I think, telling that all of these are moving in the predicted direction. And here again, we see after all of these controls, so the changing state demographics, changing poverty, that if you increase taxes on the poor, fewer people are graduating from high school. That's the association. And then this final one is taxes and births to unmarried mothers. And so here the statistical significance is much smaller, but again, kind of moving in the direction we expect. And so this is, I think, telling that all these directions, all of these regression analyses are moving in the directions that we expect. They're statistically significant. Some of them have pretty sizable magnitudes, especially on crime. So we do think that there is a case to be made that increasing the tax on the poor does have an important role in explaining these negative outcomes we see. But we're going to talk a little bit more now about how the mechanism of how that works.
So what is the pathway by which these outcomes might be coming to pass? How do we figure out why this mechanism is working the way it seems to be working? Well, this is the part of our story that requires a lot more thought and a little bit of speculation. When we raise regressive taxes, what are we really doing to families? In an argument that will probably resonate to some degree with conservatives who oppose taxes most of the time, we're going to suggest that raising taxes is a way of taking money out of people's pockets. But raising regressive taxes, as most liberals will recognize, is taking that money disproportionately out of the pockets of the most vulnerable people in the country. It leaves them with fewer dollars to pay for grandma's medication or to fund a healthy diet, both of which could impact mortality. It depresses the spending power of the poor, which could have an impact on property crime. In short, for any outcome where the literature tells us that resources matter, regressive taxation should matter as well. But if that's true, we should expect to see that other ways of taking money or reducing the resources available to the poor will be associated with similar poverty-related outcomes. So is it? That's part of what we wanted to test now. So, to test income as a mechanism, we ran another fixed effects model, yet instead of using taxes as the predictor, we were looking at the mean income of the bottom quintile for each state. And we see here a significant relationship. As the poorest citizens of each state increase their income, state mortality falls. This relationship is net of spending patterns in a state. So while it's true, sadly, that states that tax the poor also spend a lot less on them, that's factored out in this association because we've controlled for that effect in our models for the most part. The same story could be told about the relationship between mean income at the bottom and state property crime rates. So you can see that as the mean income of the bottom quintile increases, the state property crime rate decreases. The same is true of violent crime. Again, controlling for all of the long list of variables that Rourke mentioned. We were particularly interested in the relationship between sales taxes, including the food taxes like the ones I mentioned at the very beginning, on a health outcome that we know is related to a whole passel of serious health problems, obesity. We reasoned that state sales tax creates a kind of sticker shock for food. Well, public health scholars tell us that increasing the price of food tends to make low-income people shift to poorer diets. They shift toward food that's cheaper, that's filling, and basically bad for you. Sales tax is another way of jacking up the cost of food, and hence we thought sales taxes might have some consequences for obesity. And here we see that an increase in sales tax is associated with an increase in state-level obesity rates, and this relationship is significant at the 0.01 level. Now, I want to mention along the way that we are only able to measure these outcomes at the state level, meaning across the entire state population. That should make it more difficult to find these outcomes because we're looking at the consequences of raising taxes on one part of the population, the poor, and an outcome that's measured at the state level. So the fact that we find these fairly robust associations, we think tells us something. In the southern states, where this kind of revenue-raising device is particularly popular, we may be paying a particularly serious price in the health and well-being of the population, as all those maps at the very beginning of my talk suggested. Now, if the link between state and local tax policy and these poverty-related outcomes was just a matter of history, the long history that I recounted at the beginning of this talk, the long reach of the Civil War and the aftermath of Redemption-era politics, this talk might be less relevant to contemporary policy. But it is precisely the politics of taxation, as expressed in those supermajority rules, and the contagion effect that holds down tax rates in neighboring southern states, which is not just a historical story. Over the last 25 plus years, the regions have continued to diverge in their tax treatment of the poor. The southern states always taxed the poor a bit higher than other regions, but during this time period, our lifetimes, the divergence between regions has grown markedly. The South is raising taxes on poor households, while the rest of the country is either holding them steady, as is true in the Midwest and the West, or shoving them down, as is true in the Northeast. Meanwhile, the revenue flowing from the federal government to the South is climbing. Relative to other regions of the country, where the amount the federal government is sending in is largely flat or even falling, the South has seen a very sharp uptick in federal spending per dollar of federal taxes paid. But this federal rescue, if we want to call it that, to the southern states, has not been enough to stem or reverse the tides of poverty-related outcomes that we sociologists care about. And we argue that as long as the poor are losing dollars, we're likely to see those trends continue. Well, what then are the solutions? If the health and well-being of the most vulnerable families in our country is at risk because of the way that revenue is raised to support the public sector, what could we do that would change the outcomes, which are very costly in productivity, in family stability, of human capital, and in incarceration rates? The Great Depression and the New Deal offer some lessons for what might make sense, and here I'm going to reference the work of my colleague Sibel Fox, who has recently completed a book on the subject of New Deal politics. The New Deal both created and federalized many aspects of the nation's safety net, and the war on poverty followed suit many decades later. Food stamps, SSI, Medicare, Social Security are all programs administered by the federal government. And they are essential supports for all American families, but they are particularly critical, I'm sure you will all agree, for the poor and the aged. Their federal status protects them to some degree from the vagaries of state differences in public attitudes toward the proper role and size of the safety net. These variations are expressed in public debate at the federal level, as we've seen most recently in the healthcare case, but overall, we would argue the tempering influence of national policy over state variation is salutary. It won't surprise you then to learn that one of our suggestions for remedying the situation we've described tonight to address the persistent and deep poverty of the southern states is to federalize the remaining social policies that play such a critical role in ameliorating the impact of poverty. TANF, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, as well as education, all of these benefits are presently heavily state influenced. If we were able to federalize them, we might expect two benefits. First, it would ensure that the poor receive the benefits they need regardless of state residence. And second, it will ease the burden placed on poor states who have greater need within their borders. Our current system requires states to raise matching dollars for federal money. All the federal money spent on health, education, and welfare requires matching funds from the states. And that requirement that the states with the greatest need for social spending have to raise the money from the poorest tax base does help to explain why the South and other poor states tax the poor. When states are required to generate revenue to support the poor, poor states don't have very many other options. We can adjust those payments to take into account regional differences in the cost of living, but the fundamental principle that all American families are entitled to safety nets of equivalent value should be made real, we think, by taking states out of the equation. Does this mean that poor families would be better off? Well, not necessarily. The political conflict over how much we want to be our brother's keepers will remain. It will be transferred to the federal level, but it will still be a debate. Conservatives will undoubtedly continue to argue that market discipline is essential, and liberals will counter that we have a responsibility toward one another. And we will argue that somewhere in the middle, the policies that hammer the poor merely exacerbate all the poverty-related conditions that eventually cost all of us and are costing us very dearly now. We can't afford the human capital consequences of lower educational attainment or the cost of incarceration that follows from higher crime rates, or the expense of supporting dependents whose breadwinners have died years earlier than they would have otherwise. Of course, there are other things that we can do. We can find ways to reward states that follow the federal lead in creating their own earned income tax credits, something that 24 states have done now, including some of the southern states, though not as dramatically as Rourke has explained. We can encourage them to do what the northeastern states have done by making those credits refundable by using the tax system as a mechanism for redistribution, which no southern state has done, and use the tax code as a redistributive device. That, as I said, is what the Northeast has done, and the relative benefits in terms of these outcomes we've talked about seem to be associated with that move. But fundamentally, we have to start with the proposition which animates the book that we were encouraged to write because of this lecture, that regressive taxation is taking a bad situation and making it much worse. And it's been doing so since the end of radical Reconstruction in the South. The poor whites and poor blacks of the southern states have been living under that cloud for decades. And because we have a social compact that directs federal dollars to the poorest regions of the country, the whole country is paying a steep price, and an inadequate one at that, for addressing the problems of inequality in resources. We all are trying to bail out the South, and it isn't working. We should imagine instead what other, more useful things we could do with all that funding if it didn't have to be used to plug a drain that is growing rather than sinking. And on that note, we want both of us to thank you for giving us the impetus for exploring this whole panoply of issues which were not on the sociological radar screen, definitely not on our radar screen, and now will be permanently emblazoned into our minds, and we hope into the book that will follow from this lecture. Thank you. are happy to entertain questions. Or Bob, maybe you're going to be the maestro.
Well, anybody who has question cards, if you please write down your questions and pass them to me. I will then, in an orderly fashion, select the best questions.
Starting with yours.
And then convey them thank you both enormously interesting. But let's have cards. Do we have a systematic way of collecting? We do.
Yes.
We're
We
systematically
have a
collecting
systematic
the cards.
person. He gets the hard questions, and I get the easy questions.
Okay. I don't know why we're doing it this way rather than having people raise their hands, but that's how we're doing it. So we're doing it this way.
Microphones, Bob, microphones.
Microphones. All right.
Meaning you have to go to a microphone.
Okay. How do you anticipate that sin taxes on obesity engendering food will affect the poor? Will they hurt the wallet and/or help the waistline?
You want to take what we did with sin tax, what we didn't do with sin taxes?
Sure, yeah, I mean, sin taxes broadly, so when we're looking at kind of alcohol and cigarette taxes, they're difficult to model in our story because, as you can expect, kind of when you're trying to figure out how much a family is spending on cigarettes or alcohol, it's either zero or it's a lot. And so kind of taking an average didn't quite seem right. So we didn't kind of factor that into our models so much. I think this broader question, though, of what kind of this movement to actually taxing food or taxing certain sweet beverages, I think the lesson from this is that we have to just be really thoughtful of how any broad-based tax, like a consumption tax, placed on something like food, how it affects the poor. There are ways that you can do this so that it's more progressive. So a lot of states that do tax food do offer certain credits to offset the burden to families come tax time. But I think the lesson from this is that we should be nervous about using the tax system and shifting prices in such a way that we hope behavior will follow, because then a lot of times that really does just kind of hurt the wallets of poor families.
Okay, another question. How do Southern politicians and leadership in the South explain or justify this state of affairs?
Well, that is a very interesting story. And sadly, across the country, sales taxes are actually politically quite popular. When we look at the survey evidence, we don't see a huge amount of variation across the country in the popularity of sales taxes. They have been popular all the way around, mainly because the lack of popularity, or what would you call it, the hatred for property tax is extraordinary. The hatred for income tax is sort of more or less right behind that. Sales taxes always seem to appear to most people to be fair, right? Everyone, I mean, they're not fair, they're highly regressive, but everyone pays them, they come in small amounts. You don't pay a great big lump sum. You go to the cash register when you buy your food and there's a little bit of tax on it. And so there's a lot of appeal to raising funding in this way. So it hasn't been a particular burden in the South to explain this, because across the country there is this fairly high degree of popularity for sales taxes. We are hoping people will come to recognize that these consequences that are following from raising revenue in this fashion are not worth the price that people are going to pay for all of the social ills that follow. But it is remarkably popular, and in fact now there's growing sentiment, it seems, even in many progressive circles I know, for fixing the federal deficit through a value-added tax. This makes me very nervous. In the European countries, where we see much more revenue raising through sales taxes, they are fairly popular there as well, and there's very little political flack that follows, but there's a huge welfare state redistributing to the poor and to middle-income people throughout the European countries. I would like to see that put into place first before I would want to see this device invoked, because when you study the South and look at what happened when they began to rely so heavily on this mechanism, it's not a very salutary policy. And that's partly because they don't redistribute. If you look at any form of spending, education spending, welfare spending, if you are a poor family in most of the southern states, eligibility for TANF is extremely rigid. If you earn more than, I think it was something like $3,500 a year for a family of 4, you are no longer eligible for TANF in many of the southern states. Here in California, that eligibility level goes up to about $11,000. And although there is a cost of living difference, it's not big enough to account for that gap. And then if you look at stipend levels, they are just monstrously smaller in the southern states. So the potential equalizing power of spending is most definitely not there in the southern states, and I would want to see it there before I would be willing to make this regressive mechanism the one that we continue to use to fund the South. But I would say that even the southern progressive governors, I mentioned this in my lecture, even when Clinton, when he was governor of Arkansas, and the other sort of, he had two twins or whatever, in Riley and, so there was Riley and Hunt, I believe. What was his name? Barber? Yeah. Well, even when they wanted to improve the education system, and that was a very important political goal for these southern governors, they could not raise property tax or corporate tax in order to do so, and they too ended up raising sales tax. It was the only tax they could raise, and they did. And that has, and when Clinton was asked, is that going to hurt the poor, he said, the grandchildren of the poor will thank me for this. And that's probably true, but there's a big distance between today and those grandchildren.
Can we just pause on the question of fairness? Because you say that one reason it's very popular,
People
sales
perceive it
tax,
that way.
in the South and presumably across the country, is because people somehow, polling data shows that it is very, people consider it fair. Could it also be that people consider it a matter of personal volition? Unlike property tax and income taxes, you can decide, that people have in their heads a story in which they can decide how much they consume. And therefore, it's very hard to convince them that it's not in their interest.
That's entirely possible. Of course, the expenditures we're looking at in our analysis aren't terribly discretionary. You do need to eat. You do need to put clothing on your back. We're not talking about whether you go out and buy a Maserati. But it's true that the perception is that this is fair, in part because it's discretionary, in part because everyone pays it, and somehow the notion that if everyone pays, it's fair. It's much like the Social Security system. Everyone pays in, everyone gets out, and even though Social Security is highly progressive, the general assumption is we're all doing it and we're all benefiting from it, and therein lies fairness. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think your point is right. Beyond a basic basket of goods, we can all start saying, well, this tax is optional, it's due to some action that I took, it's not being levied on me. You know, I have to have my income, so if someone's taking money out of that, I chose to buy, you know, this pair of sneakers or what have you. I think that the psychology around, you know, why the sales tax it resonates with people in a more fair way, I think is powerful, and it makes it different and unique from the other taxes that I think makes it especially attractive.
In fact, sadly, I think the concept of progressive taxation has never actually sunk very deep into the culture. It was hard fought to begin with, and I think it would be very vulnerable if put to a vote.
Your analysis hinged on an analysis of one typical poor family and its variable tax treatment in different states. Did you run your model for different types of poor families, the same story, or no?
We started off actually with, I think, 8 different types of families, and at that point I realized work was going to leave me altogether if we kept going on this. You can imagine what it means to simulate this tax burden even with one kind of family over 26 years in 50 states. It's an amazing amount of work. We started off trying to do this for more family types and ended up bagging that because it would just be just an incredible data headache to do. It's certainly possible to do that, but what we did instead was pick the kind of family we typically worry about in poverty circles, a single parent household with 2 dependent children. Obviously, this limits the analysis, but at least it gets us toward the family that most of us have in mind when we think about the poor.
One important additional family we did test, though, was a 2-parent household with 2 children. So you could think that the tax rules could be quite different if you're a married parent. We know the tax code applies differently to 2-parent families. So we ran the same analysis with that family at the poverty line and got the exact same results. And as you can expect, there's highly correlated. You tax a single-parent family with 2 kids at the poverty line a lot, you're going to do kind of a similar thing to a 2-parent family.
If the southern states adopted more progressive tax regimes, To what extent would stark differences shown in your early slides be mitigated? You showed small and significant relationships between the tax burden and negative outcomes, but don't return to the early diagrams. What difference would changes in the tax policy actually make?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. So we were kind of wrestling with looking at kind of the size of coefficients was kind of a concern of ours. So a lot of these effects we were looking at were quite small. I think the way we approached this, that it was more important for us to actually make a compelling case that the two things are related. Because in a lot of people's heads, the idea of that this sales tax that I'm paying on food can somehow affect mortality in the long run or property crime rates. For a lot of people, that's kind of a large step. So it was more important to us, I think, to really isolate that relationship and show that the two things are connected. We then were kind of trying to go to the next step to actually saying, what would it look like if you multiply these coefficients by, the change that we see? And the numbers, kind of as you were getting a sense of, aren't that large. And the thing is that, the best thing to do would be to have an experiment. And I think a lot of the stuff that's done that Heckman has done, kind of modeling the effect of early childhood education, he's really capitalizing on an experiment where you actually have a counterfactual. And so you can really explore all of the ways that reducing this burden on poor families would have kind of positive outcomes for their consumption patterns and also for all of these outcomes that we care about. So that would be the ideal way to actually get kind of a magnitude of effect. But you're right. I mean, we can't quite say kind of how big the effect might be. But you can definitely get a sense that if you change the tax structure, you might also be changing the spending structure, and a lot of these things will be moving together, hopefully in a positive way.
It also bears remarking, I think, that the gap between the most progressive state and the worst states is not trivial. It is huge. That Vermont, if we looked at comparison between this poor family in Vermont and the same poor family in Mississippi, it's about $2,300 a year on an annual income of, what was it, like $18,000 at the poverty line. This is not a tiny difference. And so we do think that that it would make a difference if taxation was constructed differently in the South. And what we're trying to do as a country is remedy this by shoving federal dollars in to the southern states. And we can see that that's really inadequate. It's better than nothing, but it's inadequate to the task.
How does geographic mobility figure into your analysis? Do you have any data on the extent to which poor people in the South who are arguably getting a very, very bad deal are moving to states that offer a better deal? Historically, we know that there's been a great deal of mobility, but what about the last 20 years that you're focusing on?
Yeah, I'd say, I think some people in the room have kind of studied this closer than we have, but if we look at kind of just the welfare reform literature, where there's a lot of debate about whether or not families are moving to states with more generous benefits, we don't see the high degree of mobility among poor families that typically we would think of. I mean, people obviously are quite rooted in where they live, and they're not making the decision that, I can get a $500 back in my check in April if I moved across the border. The other interesting thing to consider, and what we've enjoyed dialoguing with political scientists about, is kind of that it's a true regional effect. So if you're considering moving to get out to a state with a much better tax burden, you're not just moving from Alabama to Mississippi. You need to move to New England or to the Northwest. And so it's kind of, states are really clumping in a way that's interesting, that leads one state, if they have the lowest tax burden and on the rich and the highest on the poor, then the states around them do the same thing.
What do you make of the persistent arguments of those who disagree with you on the virtues of raising business taxes, that this drives business out of the state, ultimately decreases the amount of money available to help the poor?
That is a very important point, and it's been raised in a number of places where we've done dry runs of this lecture. In fact, some have argued that if we look at what poverty rates were like in the South, if we roll back to the earliest point for which we have measurements, like 1959 or so, the South was way worse than the rest of the country, and a lot of that gap has been closed. It is still the case that the gap is there, but it's nowhere near as big as it was in the 1950s. To which we answer, the other poverty outcomes we're looking at are looking worse and worse as time goes on. And so although some gaps have closed, for example, unemployment is nowhere near the problem in the South that it was in the past, because it's true, industry has located in the South, low-wage industry in particular. And you can debate whether or not providing people with low-wage employment is better than unemployment. I personally actually would agree with that proposition, that low-wage employment beats being completely unemployed, but it's not a very positive solution, and that is the low-road solution that the southern states have made most use of. increasingly, sadly, the Midwest has been saddled with not exactly the similar policy, but the high-wage jobs have just disappeared and haven't been replaced by new high-wage jobs. So you're seeing a similar trend develop in places like Cleveland and in Michigan and so on. And that's not their choice, whereas in the southern states, the right-to-work states, the states with low unionization have deliberately courted low-wage employment and low business taxes, and it has certainly worked to the extent that it's attracted business.
And I'll add that the corporate income tax is a much smaller piece of the state and local tax picture than I think we commonly think of. So remember that slide from earlier. It was really the property tax, the income tax, and the sales tax that really are funding state and local services. So I mean, a lot of this discussion immediately goes to we should be taxing business more, but really it's about having progressive taxes on property and income where you kind of are generating your real revenue at this level.
Here's a historic question for $100. Did Huey Long raise non-sales taxes to pay for infrastructure like hospitals, roads, and so on? Long obviously was the governor of Louisiana.
I don't know, Robin, where are you? Can you tell us about Huey Long?
No, I can't.
Sibel, can you tell us? Well, okay, we can't tell you because we haven't studied Huey Long, and I mean, Huey Long was famous for his soak the rich politics. I don't know enough about how he proposed or whether he actually succeeded in doing so. He went after the oil interests in Louisiana, and of course, if you have a source like oil or a source like timber in the Northeast, in the Northwest, you have a revenue source. Alaska does the same thing, that to some degree protects you from all of the above because you can soak that industry if you can get your hands around it. So I don't know how much of what Huey Long proposed was aimed at the rich industry in his state and how much was tipping income tax, but he certainly made a career out of the idea that progressive income tax and progressive taxes should matter. I should say, by the way, that one of the things we haven't talked about in this lecture but is in the book is that there was resistance to these policies. I mean, we've talked as if everybody in the southern states agreed with this, but there were resistance movements. Virginia has one of the most colorful histories of these resistance movements, and there were Southern New Dealer Democrats who pushed back at this policy, and we have some newspaper coverage from the 1930s that shows very vividly how well these opponents to this regressive policy understood that that's what it was about. And when these sales taxes were raised, there were banner headlines in many southern states that said, relief for property owners. It was very well understood exactly what the trade-offs were. So I don't want you to come away thinking that this was total capitulation and nobody even recognized what was going on. On the contrary, there were some both interesting and important political movements that were pushing back. They just didn't succeed. And one of the reasons they didn't succeed were all the other restrictions on voting. The very people most likely to be hammered by these policies were not allowed to vote. And that made a big difference in the victories that underlined this regressive tax policy.
Could you please explain the per capita rise of the prison population chart, or the rate of prison population chart? Please explain your regression results in what a $100 increase means in terms of for the prison population at that level.
So the regression results we're looking at state overall crime rates, which is different from the prison populations, because the prison population is both an artifact of the crime rates and also kind of the punitiveness of your state system. And so the South, we know, is quite a bit more punitive than the rest of the country. So that explains part of the prison story. But we also know that the violent and property crime rates are also higher in the South.
So that $100 doesn't have to do with incarceration per se. That's a knock-on consequence.
Crime rates.
Are there any international examples to support your conclusions?
International. Well, as I said about the European case, what you see there are very high sales taxes, but accompanied by an extremely well-developed redistributive system and a very strong welfare state. So they have coupled two policies which mean that sales taxes work for them because they're giving so much back in a progressive direction. We aren't. And in fact, in the states where this is heavily used as a source of revenue raising, exactly the opposite happens, very thin welfare states. So, I mean, I guess the only thing I could say is the European case, I think, reinforces the importance of getting the redistribution side of it right before you invoke this regressive mechanism.
There's also important differences between a value-added tax and then an end-game kind of sales tax, and how it's actually applied to the consumer and how it affects their budget, that I think have important implications for how it's actually felt in the household. And one thing I think is interesting to keep in mind when we're having this conversation in Congress, if people are actually seriously considering a VAT, is how quickly I feel like that conversation will be turned into a consumption or a sales tax in the US, because that's what we're familiar with, and that's had all these fairness characteristics. We kind of leave business out of it, put it on the consumer. And that's a very kind of a slippery slope. I think you start talking VAT in this country, it quickly becomes a sales tax, whereas in Europe, they're structured very differently in a way that they don't impact the household in quite the same way.
And I also think, I mean, you're the person with the most political experience in the room. The tendency to want to use that revenue to plug deficits, I think, would be extremely pronounced. It's not at all clear to me that it would be used to improve education, to improve, I mean, maybe it would as long as Obama's in control, but I'm not so sure that if we raised revenue in this fashion, we would see it redistributed through spending policies that would necessarily be progressive. One would hope, but I wouldn't lay money on it.
A couple of questions. I think you touched on this already, but there are questions and people would like more explanation. How is the $100 increase in taxes on the poor dispersed?
How is it dispersed?
You mean through spending? Whose question was that? Can you explain what you meant?
I know you talked about it for the change of outcomes. So was that like hypothetical, the $100?
No, it's just an increment. Well, I mean,
Yeah, it's just a way to kind of interpret the coefficient, kind of what that kind of means, to give a sense of the magnitude. Part of it is to kind of be very transparent in the story that we're not saying that we're explaining kind of the north-south difference in poverty by, you know, a 10% sales tax. So part of it was just to give a sense of the magnitude and to interpret the coefficient.
but as I said before, the gap between the most progressive and the least and the most damaging state is 23 times. You know, it's $2,300. That's a pretty big difference.
We're running out of time. Just one other question. What we're seeing in many states is, that are just getting to the limit in terms of sales taxes up to about 9 or 10%, is a movement toward taxing services. And have you looked or thought about the regressive consequences of taxing services?
We use the Consumer Expenditure Survey to construct this data set and to do this. We don't have services in that, but we thought about it.
And in separate analyses, so, and I didn't get that level of detail here, but the consumption that we're looking at is household durables, clothing, food, that basket of goods. We had a broader set that included utilities and services, which are also taxed in many states, and the results are substantively the same. We didn't use those because the actual data out there on those tax rates that can vary a lot by localities isn't nearly as sound, and especially going back in time, you'd have a lot of gaps. But I think the looking at services is going to be an important part of the story because it's definitely going to expand the amount of consumption that's liable to taxes for these families.
A final political question, if there are no other questions. We see in the South, particularly, a tremendous effort and we've seen up to 40 years, in light of the Voting Rights Act, to register the poor, a lot of the minorities, and in recent presidential elections, we've had very, very high rates of voting among the poor, among African Americans. Is there likely to be, even with these constitutional provisions, a turning point or a tipping point at which you've got a poor population that demands a different tax regime?
Well, I wish you were right, but I have to say the experience of going to Alabama was very sobering because there have been several campaigns to try and repeal the food tax. One of them actually got past the state legislature and went all the way to a referendum. And when you look at the distribution by race of votes on that referendum, it's very sobering. There was a huge political campaign to persuade black voters that this was going to raise their taxes, and they too voted against the repeal of that food tax. I wish that were true, and maybe it will be. It requires more than just registering people. It requires educating them about their own best interests. And also, I think we're seeing the long-term damage of high rates of inequality. If you've got a poorly educated population, it's going to be very, very difficult to bring them into this political atmosphere and make sure that they understand. they've almost been enforced with a lack of understanding of what their true situation is as a consequence of educational inequality. So I think there's a very, very long way to go, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. Voting Rights Act, the civil rights era told us about what was possible.
On that upbeat note, we're going to bring this to a close. Bork and Kathy, thank you so much.